Tell me in the comments. Have you ever been judged by someone who thought they were better than you? And if you've ever watched an underdog, prove everyone wrong. Subscribe and stay until the end, because this story takes a turn nobody in that castle saw coming. Now imagine this. You're standing in front of one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. You've worked 16 hours a day. You've slept barely 4 hours. You've done everything you were asked to do. And then, in front of dozens of people, he looks directly at you and says, "You're useless," not because you failed, not because you made a mistake, but because he never believed someone like you mattered. This is the story of a duke who thought a young seamstress was worth less than the fabric she carried. 3 days later, he would discover who she really was, and it would change everything. The kingdom of Alderwin loved titles. People respected dukes. People bowed to counts. People praised merchants with gold. And people ignored everyone else, especially people like Clara Whitmore. At 24 years old, Clara lived in a tiny stone cottage near the edge of the capital. The roof leaked when it rained. The fireplace smoked during winter. And every copper coin she earned disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. But Clara never complained, because she had learned something years earlier. Complaining didn't fill empty stomachs. Working did. Every morning before sunrise, she sat beside a narrow window sewing dresses for noble families. Wedding gowns, ball gowns, court uniforms. Expensive clothes worn by people who would never remember her name. The nobles admired the finished work. The merchants admired the craftsmanship. Yet almost nobody ever asked who made it. To them, Clara wasn't a person. She was simply another worker, another invisible hand, another forgotten face. And strangely enough, she was fine with that, at least most of the time. The trouble began on a rainy Tuesday morning. A royal celebration was approaching. Nobles from every corner of the kingdom were expected to attend. The event was enormous. Months of preparation, thousands of guests, countless opportunities for wealthy families to display their power. Among them was Duke Alexander Hawthorne, the youngest duke in the kingdom, 32 years old, brilliant, respected, feared. The kind of man whose arrival could silence an entire room. Alexander had inherited one of the largest estates in the kingdom after his father's death. Under his leadership, the estate expanded, profits doubled, trade routes flourished. His reputation grew. People admired his intelligence. But they also feared his arrogance, because success had convinced him of something dangerous, that he was almost always right. And when someone spends years believing they're always right, eventually they stop listening. That morning, Clara received an urgent message. A messenger arrived soaked from the rain.
"Miss Whitmore, yes."
"The Hawthorne estate requires your services immediately." Clara blinked. "The Hawthorne estate?" The messenger nodded. "There has been an issue with garments prepared for the royal celebration." That surprised her. The Hawthorne family normally hired prestigious tailoring houses, not independent seamstresses. But work was work, and Clara couldn't afford to refuse. So she packed her sewing kit and followed the messenger. The Hawthorne estate was larger than some villages. Massive iron gates, perfect gardens, marble fountains, servants moving in every direction. Everything about the property screamed wealth. Clara tried not to stare. Inside, chaos had erupted. Boxes of clothing covered tables. Servants rushed between rooms. Tailors argued with assistants. Someone was shouting about missing fabric. Another person was demanding revised measurements. Clara quickly understood the problem. A shipment of ceremonial garments had been ruined during transport. The celebration was only days away. Panic had spread through the household. She immediately began helping, quietly, efficiently, without seeking attention. Hours passed, then more hours. One repair became 5. 5 became 20. Clara barely stopped moving. She fixed tiers, adjusted seams, reworked damaged embroidery, saved garments others had already given up on. And little by little, the crisis began to stabilize. Several servants noticed. One whispered to another, "She's incredible." Another nodded. Half these outfits would have been ruined without her. But Clara didn't hear them. She was too focused on her work. Late that evening, Duke Alexander finally entered the workshop. The room immediately fell silent. People straightened their backs. Conversations stopped. Alexander walked through the room, reviewing progress. His expression remained cold, professional, controlled. Then he reached Clara's station. He glanced at the garments she'd repaired. For a brief moment, genuine surprise crossed his face. The craftsmanship was exceptional. But before he could ask questions, one of his senior tailors spoke. "We've managed to recover most of the damaged pieces, Your Grace." Alexander nodded. "Good." The tailor hesitated, then pointed toward Clara. This woman assisted significantly. Alexander looked at Clara. Not really at her work, not really at her accomplishments, just at her. Simple dress, worn boots, calloused hands, no title, no status, no influence. And in that single moment, he made a judgment, the kind people make every day, the kind that changes lives. "Assisted?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace." Alexander glanced back at the garments, then shrugged. "I'm sure anyone with a needle and enough time could have done the same." The room went quiet. Several servants exchanged uncomfortable looks. Clara froze. Not because the comment hurt, because it was familiar. She had heard versions of it her entire life. "You're just lucky. Anyone could do that. It's not impressive." "You don't matter," Alexander continued walking. Then he added something worse, something that would echo through the estate for days. "Let's not exaggerate her importance." He waved dismissively. "Without skilled leadership, effort alone is useless." Then, looking directly at Clara, he said, "You're useless without people above you telling you what to do." Silence. Absolute silence. Even the tailors looked shocked, because everyone in that room knew the truth. The repairs had succeeded largely because of Clara. Yet nobody challenged the Duke. Nobody. Because power often speaks louder than truth. Clara slowly lowered her eyes. Not from shame, from disappointment. She had expected arrogance. She hadn't expected cruelty. For a moment, she considered responding, explaining, defending herself. But she didn't, because experience had taught her another lesson. You cannot force people to see your value, especially when they have already decided you have none. So she simply nodded, gathered her tools, and continued working. The Duke never looked back. That night, however, something unusual happened. Several servants approached Clara privately. One baker offered fresh bread. A maid thanked her for helping save the celebration. A stable worker apologized for the Duke's behavior, and each conversation revealed the same thing. People respected Clara, far more than she realized. Because while Alexander commanded authority, Clara earned admiration. There is a difference. One can be demanded, the other must be deserved. The next morning, whispers spread throughout the estate. Many people were angry, not because Clara had been insulted, because the insult felt unfair. People can tolerate arrogance. What they struggle to tolerate is injustice. Yet Alexander remained unaware. He continued preparing for the royal celebration, holding meetings, reviewing guest lists, managing logistics. Confident everything was under control, he believed the matter was finished, forgotten, insignificant. What he didn't know was that 3 days earlier, a letter had begun traveling toward the capital. A letter carrying information powerful enough to shake the kingdom's highest circles. Information connected directly to Clara Whitmore. Information nobody, not even Clara herself, fully understood yet. And by the time that letter arrived, the Duke's careless words would become the greatest mistake of his life. Because Clara wasn't who everyone thought she was. Not even close. And in less than 72 hours, the entire kingdom would find out. The morning after Clara was insulted, life at the Hawthorne estate appeared normal. Servants worked, carriages arrived and departed. Preparations for the royal celebration continued. From the outside, everything looked perfectly organized. But beneath the surface, something had changed. People were talking, quietly, carefully, yet constantly. Not because Clara had argued, not because she had defended herself, but because she hadn't. Most people expect anger after humiliation. What unsettles them is dignity, especially when dignity exposes the ugliness of someone else's behavior. The servants couldn't stop thinking about it. The seamstress who had saved countless garments, the woman who worked longer than anyone else in the workshop, had simply accepted the insult and continued helping. That kind of strength leaves an impression, and impressions spread. Meanwhile, Clara returned home. Her cottage felt unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. A kettle simmered over the fire. Everything should have felt familiar. Instead, something felt unsettled, not because of the Duke's words. She had survived worse. Far worse. The problem was that his words had awakened old memories. Memories she usually kept buried. Questions she had spent years ignoring. Questions about her parents. Questions about her childhood. Questions about a past filled with missing pieces. Clara had been raised by her grandmother, a strong woman named Eleanor. When Clara was 6 years old, she asked where her parents were. Eleanor never gave a clear answer. They loved you very much. That was all she would say. When Clara turned 10, she asked again. Eleanor's eyes filled with sadness. Some truths arrive when they're ready, nothing more. By 15, Clara stopped asking. Not because she stopped caring, because she realized nobody intended to answer. And over time, she built a life around what she did know. She knew how to work. She knew how to survive. She knew how to stand back up when life knocked her down. The missing pieces remained missing. And eventually, she accepted that they probably always would. But that same afternoon, nearly 100 miles away, a rider crossed the northern border of the kingdom, carrying a sealed leather case. His name was Thomas Everley. He was 61 years old, a retired magistrate, a man known for keeping records so precise that courts often used them to settle disputes decades later. For most of his life, Thomas had protected a secret he never intended to reveal. Yet circumstances had changed, because 2 weeks earlier, while organizing old archives, he had discovered documents believed lost forever. Documents connected to one of the kingdom's most powerful families, and one forgotten child. A child whose existence had vanished from official records, or so everyone believed. As Thomas traveled toward the capital, he replayed the discovery in his mind. The hidden ledger, the sealed correspondence, the signatures, the dates. Everything matched. Everything. There was no mistake. And if the information was genuine, one woman currently living as an ordinary seamstress possessed a connection to nobility that would shock the entire kingdom, perhaps even the royal court itself. Back at the Hawthorne estate, Duke Alexander remained focused on the celebration. Unfortunately for him, life was beginning to present signs, small signs, the kind people ignore until hindsight makes them obvious. The first sign came during a planning meeting. One of his senior advisors spoke carefully. "Your Grace, may I ask a question?" Alexander looked up. "Go ahead. The seamstress." Alexander frowned. "What about her?" The advisor hesitated. "Several staff members believe she deserves recognition." Alexander sighed, already irritated. "For repairing clothing, she did considerably more than that." Alexander leaned back. "And?" The advisor chose his next words carefully. "People notice how leaders treat those beneath them." The room became silent.
Before we continue, I want to ask you something. Maybe at work, maybe at school, maybe even by your own family. And later regretted it, comment, "I've been there." And if you're enjoying this story so far, take a second to subscribe, because what happens next completely changes Clara's life. about to learn a truth he never saw coming.
Alexander's expression hardened. Are you questioning my leadership? No, Your Grace. But everyone knew that wasn't entirely true. Because he was. And deep down, Alexander knew it too. The second sign came later that evening. A conversation with his housekeeper. Mrs. Hawthorne had served the family for nearly 30 years. She rarely criticized anyone, which is exactly why Alexander paid attention when she did. I'd like to say something. He looked up from a document. About what? Miss Whitmore. Alexander's jaw tightened again. The housekeeper continued. She's respected. So I've heard. Respect isn't given lightly. Alexander returned to reading. I'm busy. The housekeeper remained standing. Then I'll be brief. He finally looked at her. She met his eyes without fear. Your father made a similar mistake once. Alexander frowned. What mistake? He judged a man based on his position. The room grew quiet. And? The housekeeper answered softly. He regretted it for the rest of his life. Then she walked away, leaving Alexander alone with thoughts he didn't particularly enjoy. For the first time since the incident, the Duke found himself thinking about Clara. Not obsessively, not emotionally, just enough to become irritated. Had he been harsh? Perhaps. But surely people were exaggerating. He hadn't ruined her life. He hadn't dismissed her from employment. He hadn't punished her. He had simply spoken honestly. Or so he told himself. Yet something kept bothering him. A detail he couldn't explain. When he insulted her, she hadn't looked angry. She hadn't looked frightened. She hadn't looked intimidated. She had looked disappointed, as though she expected better. That reaction unsettled him far more than anger ever could. The following day, the royal celebration finally arrived. The capital exploded with activity. Music filled the streets. Merchants displayed luxury goods. Nobles arrived in decorated carriages. Thousands gathered to witness the event. Inside the palace, chandeliers illuminated massive halls lined with gold and crystal. Everything glittered. Everything sparkled. Everything looked perfect. At least on the surface. Clara attended only because one of her completed gowns had been selected for presentation. A rare honor for a seamstress. She wasn't there as a guest. She wasn't there as nobility. She stood quietly among artisans and craftsmen, invited to observe from designated sections, exactly where society expected her to be. Invisible, forgotten, unimportant. Or so everyone assumed. Several hours into the celebration, a palace guard entered carrying a sealed message. He moved quickly through the crowd, crossed the ballroom, approached a royal official, whispered something. The official's eyes widened instantly. A second official was summoned. Then a third. Within minutes, several influential figures had gathered. Their expressions grew increasingly serious. Whispers spread. Questions followed. People noticed. Something unusual was happening. Something important. Duke Alexander noticed too. And when powerful people begin exchanging worried looks, other powerful people pay attention. He approached one of the officials. Is there a problem? The official hesitated, then answered carefully. A matter requiring verification. What kind of matter? The man lowered his voice. A family matter. Alexander frowned. Whose family? The official glanced around, as though ensuring nobody else could hear. Then he spoke a name Alexander hadn't heard in years, a name connected to one of the kingdom's oldest, noble houses. A family believed to have ended with tragedy more than 2 decades earlier. Alexander stared. That's impossible. The official nodded slowly. We thought so too. Across the hall, Clara remained unaware. She was admiring embroidery displayed near one of the exhibits, completely oblivious to the fact that multiple members of the royal administration were now discussing her past, discussing documents that had just arrived, discussing records hidden for 24 years. Then something happened that stopped the entire room. A royal herald entered. His voice echoed through the ballroom. Attention. Conversations ceased, music faded, Every eye turned toward him. The herald unrolled a document, his expression unusually serious. Then he announced, "A matter concerning succession records has been brought before the crown." Instant confusion swept through the hall. Succession records? Inheritance? Noble lineage? What was happening? The herald continued. Pending verification, an individual currently residing within the capital may possess a direct legal claim connected to House Ashford. The room erupted. House Ashford, one of the wealthiest noble families in kingdom history. A family whose surviving bloodline had supposedly disappeared decades ago. People immediately began whispering. Who was it? Which noble family had hidden an heir? Which count? Which baron? Which aristocrat? And then Alexander heard a name, a single name, spoken quietly by one of the officials nearby. A name that instantly drained the color from his face. Clara Whitmore. For several seconds, he genuinely thought he had misheard. The seamstress? The woman from the workshop? The woman he called useless? No. Impossible. Absolutely impossible. And yet, every official standing nearby looked deadly serious. No one was laughing. No one was joking. No one appeared uncertain. For the first time since inheriting his title, Alexander felt something he rarely experienced. Fear. Because if the documents were real, then 3 days ago, he hadn't humiliated an ordinary seamstress. He had publicly humiliated a woman whose identity could shake the entire kingdom. And worse, the verification process had already begun. The ballroom buzzed with confusion. Hundreds of conversations erupted at once. Nobles whispered. Officials exchanged documents. Servants strained to overhear. And at the center of it all stood a woman who still had no idea why her name had suddenly become the focus of royal attention. Clara Whitmore, the seamstress, the invisible worker, the woman most people had ignored their entire lives. Across the room, Duke Alexander felt a knot forming in his stomach. The feeling was unfamiliar. He was used to controlling situations, used to having answers, used to being the smartest person in the room. But now, for the first time in years, he had none. He watched as senior royal officials approached Clara. The crowd parted immediately. People noticed. People stared. And when powerful people begin walking towards someone society normally ignores, everyone pays attention. Clara looked genuinely confused. Is something wrong? One of the officials bowed respectfully, not deeply, but enough to shock everyone nearby, including Clara. No, Miss Whitmore. The official paused. We simply need to ask you a few questions. The ballroom grew quieter. People moved closer, trying not to appear obvious, failing completely. The official continued carefully. Your grandmother was Eleanor Whitmore? Yes. Is she still living? Clara's face softened. No, she passed away 4 years ago. The official exchanged glances with another administrator. That answer seemed important. Very important. What about your parents? Clara hesitated. I never knew them. The official nodded slowly. As we suspected, those 4 words sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. As we suspected. Meaning they already knew something. Something Clara did not. The questioning continued. Birth records, childhood locations, family possessions, old documents. Tiny details most people would consider meaningless. Yet every answer seemed to strengthen whatever conclusion the officials were reaching. And with each passing minute, the room became more silent, more tense, more fascinated. Then an elderly man entered the ballroom. Travel-worn, gray-haired, carrying a leather case. Thomas Everley, the retired magistrate. The man who had traveled across the kingdom with documents hidden for nearly a quarter century. The moment officials saw him, they immediately escorted him forward. Several noble families recognized him. A man known for honesty. A man whose records had never once been proven false. That fact alone made people nervous. Thomas approached Clara. His eyes softened. For a moment, he simply looked at her, as if seeing a ghost. or perhaps seeing someone he thought he'd never meet. Finally, he spoke. "You have your mother's eyes." The words landed like thunder. Clara froze. "What?" The old man smiled sadly, exactly like hers. For the first time all evening, fear touched Clara's face. Not fear of danger, fear of answers, because answers change lives, and some answers change them forever. Thomas slowly opened the leather case. Inside were carefully preserved documents, letters, certificates, official seals, records hidden for decades. The ballroom was now completely silent. Nobody wanted to miss a single word. The chief royal administrator stepped forward. After reviewing the evidence one final time, he looked toward the gathered crowd. Then he addressed Clara directly. "Miss Whitmore," his voice echoed across the hall. "We believe your grandmother spent 24 years protecting a secret." Clara felt her heart pounding. "What secret?" The administrator inhaled slowly, then answered, "The secret of who you really are." The room held its breath. 24 years earlier, House Ashford had been one of the most influential families in the kingdom. Their wealth was legendary, their political influence enormous. Their future appeared secure. Then tragedy struck. A carriage accident took the lives of multiple family members. A fire destroyed important records. And amid the chaos, a newborn child disappeared. Official investigations failed. Witnesses contradicted one another. Eventually, authorities concluded the infant had died during the disaster. The case was closed. History moved on. The bloodline was declared extinct. Except, the infant had never died. A terrified nurse had secretly removed the child from danger. Fearing political enemies connected to the family, she fled. That nurse was Eleanor Whitmore, Clara's grandmother. The crowd gasped. Several nobles looked genuinely stunned. Others simply stared, unable to process what they were hearing. The administrator continued. Eleanor raised the child in secret. The room remained silent. She protected her identity. Another pause. She protected her life. And finally, that child was your mother. Clara felt the world tilt. Her mother? Her mother had been part of House Ashford? But the revelation wasn't over. Not even close. Thomas opened another document. This one contained birth records, marriage records, official lineage documentation, evidence connecting generations, evidence nobody knew still existed, evidence proving one extraordinary truth. The administrator looked directly at Clara. His next words changed her life forever. "Your mother was the sole surviving heir of House Ashford." The room erupted. People gasped openly. Others stood from their seats. Several nobles began arguing immediately. Some looked excited. Others looked terrified. Because inheritance claims of this magnitude could reshape power throughout the kingdom. Then came the final revelation. The revelation that left the entire ballroom speechless. "Which means," the administrator paused, "you are the last living descendant of House Ashford." Silence. Absolute silence. Clara couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't breathe properly. Every assumption she'd carried her entire life shattered in seconds. The orphan, the seamstress, the invisible worker, the forgotten girl. None of those things explained who she truly was. For 24 years, she had lived without answers. Now they were arriving all at once, across the room. Alexander felt his stomach drop. Because suddenly, none of this was theoretical. None of this was rumor. None of this was possibility. It was fact, verified fact. 3 days earlier, he had looked directly at the last heir of House Ashford and called her useless. In front of witnesses, in front of staff, in front of half his estate. The realization hit like a hammer, but something unexpected followed. Shame. Not because of her newly discovered status, not because of her inheritance, not because of her family name. Because he realized something much worse. She had already been valuable before any of this happened. The title changed nothing. The wealth changed nothing. The bloodline changed nothing. She had been hardworking before, kind before, talented before, respectable before, worthy of respect before. The only thing that changed was his ability to see it, and that realization hurt. Hours later, after formal proceedings concluded, Clara finally stepped outside onto a palace terrace. The cool evening air felt unreal. Everything felt unreal. She needed silence. She needed space. She needed a moment to understand what had happened. That's when she heard footsteps. She turned. Alexander stood there, alone, without advisors, without servants, without authority protecting him. Just a man. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Alexander broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." Clara studied him carefully, not angry, not bitter, simply listening. Alexander continued. "I judged you." A pause. "I dismissed you." Another pause. "And I treated you unfairly." He looked away briefly, as though the next words were difficult. "I told myself I was evaluating your contribution." He shook his head. "I wasn't." The honesty surprised even him. "I was evaluating your position." Silence. "You deserved better." For the first time in years, the Duke stopped defending himself, stopped explaining, stopped justifying, stopped pretending. He simply accepted responsibility. Clara looked toward the city's lights below. Then she asked a question. One simple question. "If nobody had discovered who I was?" Alexander immediately understood. If she had remained a seamstress, if no inheritance existed, if no title appeared, would he still be standing here apologizing? The question struck with brutal accuracy. After several seconds, he answered honestly. "Probably not." Clara nodded. Not because she liked the answer, because she respected the truth. Then Alexander said something that mattered far more. "But I should have." And that, more than the apology itself, was the moment she believed him. Weeks later, the story spread across the kingdom. People discussed the inheritance, the lost bloodline, the royal investigation, the dramatic revelation. But strangely, the story most people remembered wasn't about wealth, or titles, or noble houses. It was about a seamstress, a woman who spent years being overlooked, years being underestimated, years being judged by appearances, and who never allowed other people's opinions to define her worth. As for Clara, she inherited responsibility, influence, resources, opportunities she never imagined possible. Yet she made a decision that surprised everyone. She established schools for craftsmen, training programs for workers, financial support for widows and apprentices, scholarships for talented young people with no connections, because she never forgot where she came from, never forgot the feeling of being invisible, and never forgot how many talented people are ignored simply because society fails to look closely enough. Years later, when people asked about the greatest lesson of her life, she always gave the same answer. "Your value doesn't appear the day someone recognizes it." She would smile. It was there all along. And perhaps that's the real reason this story endured. Because every generation creates new dukes, people who judge too quickly, people who assume status equals worth, people who mistake power for wisdom. But every generation also creates people like Clara, quiet people, hardworking people, overlooked people, people whose value exists long before the world notices. And history has a funny habit of proving them right. If this story moved you, comment below. Value was there all along. And remember, never let someone else's opinion become your identity. Sometimes the people who underestimate you are simply revealing the limits of their own vision. Subscribe for more powerful stories of resilience, justice, and unforgettable reversals.
Before you go, what was the Duke's biggest mistake? Calling Clara useless, or waiting until her status changed before recognizing her worth? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next powerful tale of betrayal, redemption, and unexpected justice. And remember, Sometimes the people who overlook you today become the same people are forced to acknowledge you tomorrow.